Communication is more than just making noise or showing color. It's about transferring information in a way that affects another individual's behavior. It's a process that underlies everything from mate attraction to predator warnings to cooperative hunting. So today we're going to explore how animals send and receive signals, the sensory modalities they use, and the evolutionary forces that shape these systems. Let's first start out by highlighting an important concept in animal behavior that we've discussed at the beginning of this course. It's important to always remember the law of parsimony, that we should always resort to the simplest explanation when it explains what we're observing in animals. In the early 1900s, a horse named Clever Hans captivated audiences in Germany. Hans seemed to be able to count and even solve math problems by tapping his hoof to indicate the right answer. His trainer, Wilhelm von Osten, was convinced that Hans understood language and numbers, a revolutionary claim at the time. But when psychologist Oscar Funks investigated, he found something surprising. Hans wasn't solving problems at all. He was responding to tiny, unconscious cues from the humans around him, shifts in posture, facial tension, or breathing that signaled when he should stop tapping. Hans wasn't communicating in a human sense. He was sending subtle behavioral cues. This became a landmark case in the study of animal behavior and experimental design. Now I start with this example to remind us that throughout this lecture, we need to keep in mind that not all apparent communication is meaningful. We must separate what looks like communication from what truly is. Before we dive in, I also want to highlight that animal communication is not the same as human language. While some species show impressive vocal learning or symbolic understanding, language, with its structured grammar, syntax, and generative flexibility, remains, as far as we know, a uniquely human trait, or at least one we've developed to an extraordinary degree. But as we've seen so far in this course, this does not make animal communication any less impressive. After today's lesson, I hope you see that what animal communication may not have in terms of grammatical, structure, and generative complexity, it makes up for in other ways. So today we're going to focus on the wonders of animal communication and how signals were shaped by evolution to influence the behavior of others. We'll look at why animals communicate, or rather the evolutionary benefits, and the various sensory modalities and mechanisms that are involved. Now that we've defined what we mean by communication, we need to ask some deeper questions about its function and reliability. Is communication an honest exchange, where both sender and receiver benefit from sharing accurate information? Or is there sometimes a form of manipulation, where one individual sends a signal that influences another behavior for its own benefit, even if it misleads the receiver? From an evolutionary perspective, this tension between honesty and deception lies at the heart of understanding communication systems. If signals can be faked, why should receivers believe them? And if receivers stop responding, how do honest signals persist? These questions have driven decades of research, from early ethological views to later game theoretic and evolutionary models. In the next few slides, we're going to explore three influential perspectives on this problem. The first framework we're going to look at is known as the manipulator framework. This suggests that communication is not just an exchange of information. It's fundamentally an attempt by the signaler to influence or manipulate the recipient's behavior. Often what benefits the signaler also happens to benefit the recipient, but when the fitness interests of the sender and the receiver diverge, natural selection favors signalers who can manipulate receivers in ways that maximize their own fitness. At the same time, recipients are under the selection to read signals accurately, to distinguish honest from deceptive signals, and act in ways that maximize their own direct fitness. Darwin and Krebs describe recipients as mind readers, constantly trying to filter out signals that are merely manipulative. This dynamic produces an evolutionary arms race. Signalers evolve strategies to manipulate, while receivers evolve strategies to detect honesty. The classical ethological approach, championed by Tinbergen, views communication as largely cooperative. In many cases, both the signaler and the receiver benefit from the information being shared. When interests are aligned, there is a little evolutionary pressure for either party to be deceitful. Selection therefore tends to favor economical signals, ways of conveying information efficiently and reliably. The cooperative perspective is particularly relevant for kin interactions or reciprocal exchanges, where mutual benefit is clear and obvious. In contrast to the manipulator mind reader model, which we just talked about, which emphasizes conflict in the arms race, the classical ethological view highlights shared interest and cooperation as the driving force behind communication. Lastly, we have Zahavi's handicap principle, which offers another solution to the honesty problem. According to this idea, signals can remain honest if they are costly to produce or maintain. If a trait is expensive, only individuals with the resources or genetic quality to bear that cost can produce it. This makes the signal reliable. This is a direct connection back to our lesson on sexual selection, where we talked about certain traits being reliable indicators of a good mate. This same principle can be applied to communication too. Only a healthy individual with good genes can survive and thrive despite a handicap brought upon by communication. In this way, costly signals allow receivers to trust the information they get, even when the signaler could theoretically benefit from their deception. Now, let's look at a concrete example of this. Female toads produce more offspring when they mate with larger males, so there's a strong selective pressure for males to appear large. In theory, all males would benefit from tricking females into thinking that they're a big male when they really aren't. But in practice, the deepness of a male's croak is constrained by the anatomy of their vocal system. Only large males can produce very low-pitched calls. Small males simply cannot fake that, making croak pitch a reliable, honest signal of communication. Females can safely use this information when choosing a mate, demonstrating how physical constraints maintain honesty in communication. And this is a really good example of how Zahavi's handicap principle can be applied to communication. All right, now that we've covered how communication can be honest or deceptive, let's take a step back and ask a broader question. Why do animals communicate in the first place? At its core, communication helps animals solve problems that they encounter in their environment and social life. For example, many species use communication to coordinate foraging, like the honeybee waggle dance, which tells hive mates where food is located. Signals are essential in securing mates, from flashy courtship displays to complex songs. Communication can also warn others about predators, as seen in alarm calls or mobbing predators. Ultimately, communication enhances an animal's survival and reproductive success, which is why it's shaped so powerfully by evolution. One of the most famous examples of communication for foraging is the honeybee waggle dance. When a worker bee finds a rich food source, she returns to the hive and performs a dance on the honeycomb. The angle of the dance relative to the vertical part of the honeycomb indicates the direction of the food relative to the sun, while the duration of the waggle conveys the distance. This sophisticated system allows the colony to exploit food sources efficiently, benefiting both the scouting bee and the receiving workers. This is really interesting because the more precise the information is conveyed in the waggle dance, the greater the ability for the other bees in the colony to find the food source, and therefore the more food is brought back to the hive, and consequently increasing the inclusive fitness of the forager, since the hive is composed of individuals that are closely related to one another. So let's look at this a little bit more closely. This is an animation of the waggle dance. You see there's the waggle there in the middle, and then the bee is going to circle around both ways and then waggle again in the middle. Right? And so this sort of dance creates a pattern that looks a lot like this. But let's go ahead and extrapolate what this pattern means. First is distance. The duration of that waggle, which is that blue part I just highlighted, encodes how far the food is from the hive. Longer waggles indicate further distances, while as short waggles indicate food that is a lot closer. It also will tell the hive the direction of the food. You see here the angle of the waggle relative to the vertical of the honeycomb corresponds to the angle between the food source and the sun. For example, if the bee waggles 40 degrees to the right of the vertical, that tells the other bees to fly 40 degrees to the right of the sun to find the food. All right, let's look at those leaf-cutting ants as another example. We talked about them in the foraging lesson as they provide a fascinating example of foraging and cultivation, but they also provide a fascinating example of communication. These ants live in massive nests with a queen and hundreds of thousands of workers organized into a complex caste system. They rely entirely on the fungus that they cultivate, which grows from the leaves that they harvest. Foraging is highly organized. Some ants cut leaves, others carry them, and others process them for the fungus. To coordinate all this, the ants use chemical markers and vibrations. Pheromones from the poison glands mark trails to the food sources, particularly for sites that are relatively close to the nest. These chemicals are long-lasting, and they recruit workers efficiently to go and cut leaves to be able to cultivate the fungus. Once the ants reach the leaves, they switch to vibrational communication, which is called stridulation. And this determines exactly which leaves to work on and how to process them. So by basically combining both long-distance chemical cues and short-distance vibrational signals, the leaf-cutting ants are able to efficiently coordinate massive multi-step foraging operations, which they then use in their cultivating farming operations. Animals also communicate for love, not just finding food. A classic example of this communication for mating is found in bird songs. Male bird songs attract females, and they also defend territories from rivals. These songs aren't random. They convey multiple types of information. species identity, helping females recognize conspecific males, individual quality, where complexity, repertoire size, or consistency signals both health and skill of the caller, and also territory ownership, warning other males to stay away from their territory. So female birds use these signals to select mates, often preferring males with longer, more complex, and more frequent songs. In this way, birdsong is a critical tool in sexual selection, ensuring that both the signaler and the receiver benefit. Males gain mating opportunities, and females gain access to high-quality males. Lastly, animals also communicate to avoid being eaten. Many animals use alarm calls, visual signals, or chemical cues to warn others of danger. These signals allow groups to coordinate their escape or defensive responses, which can drastically increase survival of the individual as well as the group. For these signals to be effective, though, they need to be specific. The type of predator matters, and a one-size-fits-all alarm call can really put group members at greater risk. So let's look at a sort of a detailed example that's really, really famous in animal behavior of the vervet monkeys. It's something that we've talked about in the past, but I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into it now. So vervet monkeys provide a classic example of predator-specific communication. They face three main types of predators in their natural habitats of Kenya. They face leopards, eagles, and snakes. Rather than using a single generic alarm call, they have distinct alarm calls for each type of predator. When an eagle is spotted, they emit a cough-like call. Other vervets look into the air and they hide in bushes, basically trying to avoid any sort of aerial predator. When a leopard appears, a barking call is given, causing monkeys to climb high into the trees in order to escape from that leopard. And then for snakes, such as pythons or cobras, they'll use what is known as a chutter call. And this basically prompts the group members to stand up on their hind legs and then sort of scan the grass and the floor around them and basically move cautiously until they're sure that the coast is clear. And this system is highly adaptive. By basically giving predator-specific information, vervets ensure that group members respond appropriately to each threat. If they had one general call, say one that has always prompted them to climb trees, they could actually become more vulnerable to an aerial predator like an eagle, which could then exploit this predictable response. So this shows really how communication can convey precise information about threats, showing that animal signals are often finely tuned to ecological pressures and survival. But how in the world do animals learn these calls? Well, it differs from animal to animal, but for meerkats, who are famous for their alarm calls, they learn from watching. Because meerkats have prolonged parental care, pups have the opportunity to observe adults and learn complex alarm calls for both terrestrial and aerial predators. Researchers studying free-range meerkats in the Kalahari Desert basically played pre-recorded alarm calls to both adults and pups. They found that pups were more likely to ignore the calls at first, and even when they did respond, their reactions were slower and way less precise than the adults. For example, pups might move to shelter only after briefly observing adults scanning the sky. However, over time, the pups became better and better and responded more accurately and a lot quicker. And this shows that alarm calls are socially learned. Young meerkats acquire the correct anti-predator responses by observing adults rather than relying on fully innate reactions. So I hope it's clear that animals communicate for a variety of reasons, and the way they do so is remarkably complex. We only touched on a few examples, but there are many others. Elephants produce low-frequency vibrations through the ground, which other elephants detect through their feet. Bees can see ultraviolet patterns of flowers that guide foraging. Snakes use chemical cues to detect with their tongues, sharing information about territory and reproductive status. Electric fish generate weak electrical fields that communicate with both mates and rivals. And both bats and dolphins and other cetaceans rely on echolocation, not just for navigation, but also to convey social information. These examples show how diverse and surprising animal communication can be, reminding us that evolution often shapes signals tailored to the sensory capabilities of the receiver, not the way humans often hear it. So while many signals are honest, animals can also sometimes deceive. Deception occurs when a signaler benefits the sender by misleading the receiver. This can be intentional or an incidental consequence of signaling. Examples include mimicry, where harmless species look or sound like dangerous ones in order to avoid predation. These occur in false alarm calls, used by some birds or primates to distract rivals and steal food. And they can also occur through camouflage or deceptive displays that mislead predators or competitors. These deceptive strategies are often met with counter-adaptations by receivers, resulting in, once again, an evolutionary arms race between the sender and the receiver. A great example of deception in animal communication comes from a study in wild capuchin monkeys. While running experiments in the wild, one researcher, known as Brandon Wheeler, noted that sometimes subordinate monkeys would make alarm calls of terrestrial predators, and then the rest of the group would react to them by climbing trees to get to higher ground. Basically, by the rest of the group becoming distracted, subordinates were then able to sneak in and grab some of the food off of their experimental platforms that were hanging in the trees. So this researcher went back and conducted a series of experiments to test the behavior, and he found that it was not random. Instead, he found that subordinates were much more likely to make alarm calls than dominants. They did so more often when the food was monopolized compared to when it was dispersed. And lastly, that they made the alarm calls when they were close to the food, suggesting that they could actually obtain some of the food by being deceptive. This doesn't mean that there's any intentionality behind their alarm calls, but it certainly seems that it is a strategic response that seems to provide subordinates with some benefit by obtaining food when they otherwise could not. But not all deceptive calls are effective. After a while of being deceptive, the strategy will no longer pay off. For example, in an experiment, researchers wanted to see if ground squirrels would stop responding if a call was unreliable. Juvenile ground squirrels were exposed to recorded alarm calls in two ways. In the first condition, calls were paired with a stuffed badger, which basically indicated a reliable signal of a predator. These are represented by the green bars here. The second condition was calls without a predator. They basically played an alarm call out of a speaker but did not have any presence of a predator. These were the unreliable signals, and they are represented by the orange bars in the graph below. At first, both groups responded the same, showing equal vigilance. But after repeated exposures, squirrels that heard unreliable calls basically started to respond less strongly. They were less likely to look in the direction of the call, and they also had some more subtle changes in their posture. And so basically this shows that animals, once again, receivers of these signals, are also developing adaptations in order to counteract the deceptive calls that others might be giving. And so this really shows that ground squirrels can learn from experience which signals are trustworthy and then adjust their behavior to avoid being misled. All right, so to wrap up, I want to briefly discuss the differences between animal communication and human language. Others may disagree, but I feel that language is what sets humans apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. Yes, animals communicate in incredibly complex ways, and with more and more research, we've found that their communication systems even have elements like syntax and grammar. But generally speaking, animal communication is limited to specific immediate contexts, conveying immediate information like food is here or predators are nearby. Moreover, it's usually not generative or displaced like human language. For humans, we can communicate far beyond immediate context. Our language is generative, meaning that we can produce an infinite number of sentences using rules of syntax and grammar. It's symbolic, with words representing objects, actions, or even abstract thoughts and ideas. And it also allows for displacement, meaning that we can talk about things that are not just present, but also past, future, or hypothetical scenarios. Perhaps animals can do this, but to date we have no evidence that they can. That's why I think language is one of the key traits that really sets humans apart from the rest. We can not only teach each other about food or predators, but we can also convey abstract thoughts, plan for distant future, tell stories, and maybe I'm a bit biased, but also teach each other about really cool things through online YouTube videos. Now, that is not to say that this topic has not been extensively researched. In fact, much of the language research in apes happened right here at Georgia State at my current research facility. Over the years, researchers at the LRC have made amazing discoveries. Apes like Kanzi, Panbenicia, Sherman, and Austin have learned to use lexigram, which you can see pictured here on the top of the screen, in order to communicate with humans. They can combine symbols to make requests, describe events, and even refer to situations that they haven't directly experienced. Watching these apes work with their trainers is truly remarkable. Their intelligence, problem solving, and the ability to use symbols are awe-inspiring. One of the mentors who actually worked here with the apes told me about all the times that the apes would point to more TV or even referred to him as large foot because he was a very tall person who had very, very big shoes. Yet despite the incredible achievements, no ape has ever achieved full human language. They don't acquire syntax in the way humans do, and their ability to generate novel, complex sentences is limited. While there is still language research done in animals today, it's less focused on training animals to speak like humans. Today's research is about understanding the cognitive foundations of communication, the limits of symbolic thought, and what makes human language truly unique. All right, so let's put all this together. First, animals communicate for a variety of reasons: to find food, attract mates, avoid predators, and coordinate social behavior. Communication can take many forms, from visual and auditory signals to chemical, vibrational, or even electric cues. And importantly, these signals we see are shaped by the sensory world of the receiver, which is often very different from that of our own human perception. Second, communication is not always honest. Some signals are manipulative or deceptive, and receivers often evolve strategies to detect and respond to dishonesty. We also saw that learning plays a big role, especially in complex systems, as with meerkats requiring alarm calls, or squirrels learning which alarm calls are reliable. Finally, while animals can achieve amazing feats of communication, some even using elements of symbolic thought, human language is qualitatively different. It's generative, symbolic, and capable of displacement, letting us convey abstract ideas, plan for the future, build culture across generations, and yes, teach others about animal behavior.